So how many of you have had, at some point in your life, a psychology class? How many? So, some. Now, keep your hand up for a second. So, how many of those of you that have had a psychology class have positive memories of your psychology class? That's kind of what I thought. Okay, so that's not a... Mike does, so thank you, Mike. So we're not off to a good start. I'm hoping to change that today. I'm hoping if I can convince you of anything, I want to convince you that psychology helps us to understand both how we might actually gain acceptance or tolerance for carnivores, as well as how we might actually come to understand each other in the conflict that's going on regarding carnivores. And so I'm going to step back and kind of do a little bit more big picture, and we're not going to just talk about wolves. We're going to talk about large carnivores in general. So we're going to move over the map with these species a little bit. Let's see if I can actually get this to work for me. Okay, so I'm a psychologist. Psychologists study mental processes. In particular, we study things like attitudes or values, risk perceptions, which are internal mental constructs that we just assign these names to them. And we're interested in how they impact people's judgments, their decisions, ultimately their behavior. Environmental psychologists, which I hesitate to call myself an environmental psychologist, but I certainly play in that arena a little bit. They're also interested in how aspects of our environment affect our thinking, okay, so that we turn that around a little bit. So how do living in certain environments or interacting with certain parts of the environment, components of the environment, impact our thinking? Okay. So psychologists have a couple prototypical ways that they use to describe human judgments and decisions, and in particular, the information processing. And so one prototypical perspective comes out of economic theory, and it's commonly called the rational actor model. And this is just this idea that people all other things being equal, people will seek to maximize utility. They will seek to maximize happiness, right? They're going to do things that are in their own best interest. But this process, this rational actor sort of model, is mentally very effortful. It requires a lot of time. It requires a lot of effort. It requires perfect information if you're going to make that kind of judgment. And this prototypical model. There are few people today that actually believe that this is fundamentally the way we act. It's used and contrasted against what we might call the cognitive miser. And the cognitive miser is just someone that seeks to minimize effort. And this is much more the way we find that most people make decisions most of the time. We rely on what are called heuristics or decision shortcuts to make judgments and decisions. And we're affected fundamentally by biases. And this is all of us, by the way, scientists included. We're affected by these biases. Okay, so ideally we want to strive to be the rational actor, but most of the time we're the cognitive miser. And so I want to talk about this application of these ideas to understanding tolerance or acceptance for carnivores. So my research agenda, what I'll talk about today, really simply, in a nutshell, is how do people make judgments and decisions about animals that can kill us or the things that we value, okay? So that's what you can reduce the idea to. And I should start with a little bit of a history lesson, because I think right off the bat, I think, gosh, we have a really curious history with wildlife. These are bison skulls. If you're not familiar with the bison or American buffalo, there were once millions of these creatures across the American West, and we did our damnedest to get rid of them. In fact, if it weren't for Teddy Roosevelt and some laws that were passed very last minute to protect bison in Yellowstone National Park, we would have gotten rid of the plains bison in the United States. So he's standing atop of a pile of bison skulls in this photo. So not long after we killed off bison, and through market hunting we killed off elk and a lot of the other things that are valuable as food sources to us, all of a sudden predators became a serious problem, which shouldn't be all that surprising, right? Because we just killed off the things that they eat. And then they became a real problem for livestock producers. And so we turned, through the use of bounties and other means, poisons, to eradicating large carnivores. And we did this actually rather quickly. These bounties in the American West started about the 1860s, 1870s, and by 1930 there were no wolves pretty much anywhere in the western US. And then I say we have a curious history because lo and behold, we turn around and 50, 60 years later, as Dr. Meach told you, here we are reintroducing wolves again. So something happened in that intervening time. We don't really know. This predates any really social science kind of efforts, but something happened in that intervening time where there was some sort of change in heart that we have toward wildlife, and we decided we would give it a go and put wolves back into Yellowstone National Park. This is what the range of wolves once looked like in the lighter blue or the medium-toned blue color. That is the range of where wolves once existed throughout the conterminous U.S. So what's missing here is Alaska, right? They were never eliminated from the state of Alaska. Here's where they are today in these little clumps in Montana, Idaho, and Wyoming, and into Oregon and Washington, and now California. And then another population in the Great Lakes, and this is the Mexican wolf that was mentioned in prior talks as well. And so just, sort of one comment about this, when we talk about the recovery of wolves and why it's controversial, and why conservation groups actually have continued to file suit, one of the things we're fighting about what does recovery of a wolf population look like, right? Should these animals just exist in these most remote places, or should they exist in these other places? All of which, all of this blue area, they have much less human densities than you have here in Germany. Okay, so there's space for them. Habitat modeling shows us that there's more space for them, and we're arguing to an extent about where they should be. So I think you can express what we've been talking about today generally as a compelling conservation challenge, and that challenge is, how do we exist with animals that can kill us? And this leads to some interesting research questions, such as what factors impact individuals' judgments and decisions about large carnivores. And if we think about that rational actor model that I told you about, and the cognitive miser I told you about, we can see elements of the rational actor here, right? So it makes a lot of sense to kill animals, to take efforts to stop them when they can hurt us. It makes a lot of sense to move them, to kill them when they kill our livestock, right? That seems very rational to us. However, it also makes a lot of sense, the restoration makes a lot of sense, when you get hundreds of people standing on a hillside paying money to come see wolves in Yellowstone National Park, for example, right? So this doesn't seem like people acting irrationally. This seems like rational self-interest. But we also get people, there are inklings that maybe not all of it is rational self-interest, right? Emotion and rules in some situations, and I would say even lunacy to a point in certain situations. We have indications that people might be a little bit crazy when it comes to large carnivores, and especially wolves. So Mike mentioned the work by John Hendy, some of the really earliest work in our field, what we call the human dimensions. Another very early study, one of the first to tackle wolves, was a 1978 survey by a Yale ecologist named Stephen Kellert. And Kellert found that wolves were they're sort of near the bottom, they were among the least liked species of a whole group of types of animals that he conducted a survey about. So we decided last year, we said, gosh, it's been a really long time and nobody's actually replicated this stuff in the United States. Maybe we should see if attitudes toward these animals have changed. And there's been a lot of discussion about attitudes toward wolves and under what conditions they change and how they change and that sort of thing. So we were really interested, and we replicated his survey. And here's what we found. So out of those 26 species that he looked at, 7 of them had significant changes. And among those species were the wolf and coyote, where attitudes improved substantially over the past 36 years relative to other species. Interestingly, if you look at them as a group, in 6 cases, attitudes became more positive, and it's this group of species here that we might call historically stigmatized species, including sharks and wolves and coyotes and vultures and rats and bats, things we historically don't like, right? Those were the cases where attitudes had improved. 2 species where attitudes had actually become more negative were the swan and raccoon. And if anybody has some pet theories on to why that is, I'd be happy to talk to you later, because I got no ideas. So what does this look like from a distribution perspective? So I showed you basically change. How does this change play out? We see really substantive change, and these are large sample surveys. We had over 1,200 in our survey. Steve Kellert had 3,100 in his survey. So we're relatively confident that this change has actually taken place. So the folks in the most positive category, so we asked them on a range from 1 to 7, from very positive to very negative. The folks who indicated they were most positive actually increased 9 percentage points, okay? And the folks that were positive toward wolves as a whole increased from 43% to 61%. On the other side, there was a 17 percentage point drop in that one category of negativity, and folks who were negative toward wolves decreased from 39% of the sample in Kellert's time to just 17% in our time. So there's clear indication that there is a shift going on over the very long term. Remember, this is 36 years. Okay, so that's a sort of a very basic description of what we've seen with attitudes toward wolves in the United States. And I should pause and say, one of the things about the sampling, the procedures that both Kellert used and we used, is we're gonna oversample people in urban areas. Why? Because there are far more of the population lives in urban areas, and more people live in the urban areas now than did when Kellert even was doing that survey work. So when we heard earlier that there's a dichotomy from Dr. Skolgren, we heard that there's a dichotomy between these rural areas and the urban areas, and Mike actually told us some of the reasons why, that urbanization, education, and income may actually be driving changes in values toward wildlife, and we have an indication that that's the case. But I don't want you to confuse what I've just shown you and think that that's going to be the case in rural areas, right? This is the case overall for the United States. And Adrian Treves has really good data that shows us that in these rural areas where wolves are, within individuals, we've actually seen people become more negative, which actually may be pointing, unfortunately, to greater levels of conflict about wolves in the future. Okay, so I said I was going to talk about this application of theory of psychological models to understanding human judgments and decisions about wildlife. So we were interested in acceptance, and a very sort of rational actor model comes out of research on risk and hazards. And this model's been applied to a whole variety of different types of hazards. And we said, you know, carnivores are kind of a hazard, right? They pose risk to wildlife, they pose risk to pets. On occasion, they pose risk to us. So maybe we can apply this psychological model and actually understand something. The model suggests that perceived risks and perceived benefits, again, think rational actor, affect our acceptance or our tolerance of species. However, the model also suggests that these perceived risks and benefits are actually driven by a number of other factors. The social trust in the entity that's responsible for managing a hazard. So in our case in the US, that would be the Wildlife Management Agency, probably similarly here in Germany. Our salient value similarity, this is how much we feel we share values with the agencies that are charged with managing the hazard. And our locus of control, the way to interpret this is the extent to which we feel like we control the hazard. Through actions that I take, I can control the risk. And so our initial test of this was a case in Ohio, believe it or not. We have a recovering black bear population in Ohio, and we got the opportunity to test this. We mailed surveys to more than 9,400 people and had 2,900 respondents. And when you run survey research, you get wonderful comments from people who volunteer to kill the bears for you, or they will volunteer to be the release sites. This is part of the fun when we get surveys back. We love to open them up and to kind of go through and look at the comments, because people say wonderful things. Anyway, initially what we found is we found strong support for our model. Now we're getting to some statistics here. These are standardized regression coefficients. If you want to think about it, they range from -1 to +1, and the more they diverge from 0, the greater the effect, if you will, okay? And so what we saw is we can explain about 62% of the variance in people's judgments about black bears, their acceptability of black bears, by these risk and benefits, okay? And we also saw, consistent with the model, we saw support for the other hypotheses that I mentioned there. But this left some lingering questions for us. So attitudes are one thing, or tolerance as an attitude is one thing, but what about actual behaviors? Can we explain actual behaviors, and do they differ between behaviors that we might consider supportive actions and behaviors that we would consider oppositional actions? And then what about this role of emotion? And we heard several people talk about how emotional people can get. I saw maybe even some indication that folks can get emotional here at times regarding carnivores throughout the session. So we wanted to investigate that, and we did it by actually a kind of a unique sampling strategy that's sometimes used by political scientists. We gathered data through the use of an online forum. We posted the survey link to an online forum that had lots of discussions about wolves. It was the Wildlife News, which is based out of Idaho. And we just asked people that really cared about the wolf issue to take the time to fill out the survey. And we said, what about these people that really care about this issue? These people that often are the ones that come to the meetings and may be shouting at the managers. What do they think? Does the model still hold? And so we started by explaining intentions to engage in supportive actions. And these are actions like donating to agencies or organizations that support wolves, writing their congressperson or their legislator in support of wolves, writing a newspaper article. There's a whole variety of supportive actions. And what we found is actually that in this case, with this most involved group, the perceived benefits became far more important than the perceived risks in explaining their intention to engage in these supportive actions. We also investigated that role of emotion, this affective reaction to wolves. Psychologists use this term affect as a synonym for emotion, if you will. And so that's their emotional reaction to wolves. And we found that emotional reaction is strongly related both to perceived benefits and to perceived risks. So when I turn this model around, we keep those in mind, and we look at intention to engage in intolerant actions, we see exactly the same pattern, okay? And again, a very strong relationship between that affect, that emotional reaction, and what they believe to be true about the risks associated with wolves, okay? So we still have some lingering questions. So the model is useful for explaining both attitudes and intentions, but can we actually increase tolerance? This is the question I get from managers all the time. What good is this psychology stuff? All you can tell me is why people are irrational or why they make these decisions. How can I actually use it? Okay, so we set about trying to answer that question, and we got the idea. We asked on our initial survey that we did with the in Ohio regarding black bears, we asked people if we could contact them again. We said, we might want to contact you at some point in the future. If that's okay, will you just give us your email address? And 400, actually about 500 people did. We had to rule out some of those people because of they didn't have enough responses that allowed us to actually make these comparisons. But we had about 400 that we could actually use in a subsequent follow-up study. And so we randomly assigned those folks to 4 treatment groups, and the groups got different bits of information. This is little tiny bits of information. It amounts to what you can fit on basically about one PowerPoint slide. And one of the slides was exactly what our bear biologist told us that the slides that she delivers. Actually two of them. One of them contained this treatment of facts, which was information about bear biology and behavior, standard behavioral ecology stuff. And one of them contained this information about how to control or reduce conflicts with bears. If you're aware, there's a group called Be Bear Aware, right? And they have this whole campaign, Be Bear Aware, and it tells people how to avoid conflicts with these species. And so those were the two that we knew that were in everybody's talks. But our biologist said, we don't have anything about the benefits of bears, and you found out that that was the most important, or that was one of the most important factors. So we talked about what those might be, and we developed a slide with benefits, and then we did a combined treatment that received all three of those. And I'll show you what these treatments actually look like. This is really all they were. There was some text we called the bear facts, and there were some pretty pictures, right? And here's about the benefits of bears. And one thing I want to emphasize when we're talking about the benefits of bears, we're not trying to convince people that bears play some important ecological role like trophic cascades. We're just kind of saying what they do. We're telling them actually they were valuable for sport hunting, right? They're valuable culturally and historically to Native American people, okay? And then they also help maintain healthy ecosystems by dispersing the seeds of plants and by consuming or culling diseased wildlife, that sort of thing. Just their ecological role. And then we had the standard Be Bear Aware stuff, right? So how do you prevent conflicts with bears? Okay? And here's what the results of that study look like. When you give people just the facts, nothing happens. So these bars here indicate that the two means overlap. There's no difference pre-treatment in the gray, post-treatment in the red. There's no difference between respondents when they receive just the facts. When they receive information about controlling risks, what we actually see is it looks like it's going down. Again, the means overlap, so there's enough error there that we can't differentiate those means. The only two treatments that actually showed an effect were the benefits treatment and the combined treatment. That is, so when we told people that bears present cultural benefits, they present benefits to hunters, they serve this ecological role, that is when we actually see people become more tolerant, more accepting of bear populations. Okay. So, summary and conclusions regarding that study, we see tolerance can be explained by people's perceptions about risks and benefits, but also about things like trust, control, and their effective or emotional reaction to species. These factors, we can highlight them via strategic communications, and they're not really lengthy communications, in order to influence tolerance. Although I would say at this point, we don't know how long that effect lasts, right? We did 1 point of time, so we don't know if this is a lasting effect at this point. So our data suggest information about benefits and how to control the risks is the most important for increasing tolerance at this point. And so information that highlights, importantly, highlights only how to avoid the risks, the typical stuff that we see again and again in your Be Bear Aware campaigns. If you don't give them the benefits information, all you're doing is you're going to make risks salient, and you're going to make people less tolerant of those species, okay? Caveats. There's a lot of caveats associated with this, right? So information has to come from a trusted source. We know this from decades of research and persuasion and communication, that people they only accept information willingly if it comes from what they believe to be a trusted source. So information is more likely going to hit home when it comes from someone they trust. People with very strong or well-formed attitudes are very unlikely to change their attitudes. There's a whole lot of research, again, from the persuasion literature that suggests this is so. And people with strong emotive responses also, like those people in our last sample, are people that are unlikely to change their views. Okay, I'd left myself enough time. I think I can get through one more quick question. And this concerns the conflict. So we still had, this question about these interest groups we hear so much about. And I saw the tension actually this morning in some of the talks when the representative from the president from the Hunters Association was up here. We see it actually a little bit with the representative from the Sheep Herders Association as well. So we see these interest groups seem to draw out part of the conflict. And so one of the questions was, does that group affiliation actually impact conflict? And we know, again, from a lot of research, social science research, that we know some things about interest groups, right? So we know they tend to market information that's consistent with their beliefs, their existing views. So they're going to post information that conforms to their expectations and beliefs. They're going to probably disregard or counter-argue information that disagrees with those existing beliefs. This happens across the board. It doesn't matter which kind of interest group you're in. That's just the way interest groups function. But what about the social groups? We know social groups, particular social groups with which we identify, hunters, ranchers, conservationists, environmentalists, that those groups are really important. We attach our identity to those groups. We make them part of ourself, and we're strongly motivated to protect the group, okay? And so these groups also tend to distrust out-group sources of information, and they may be more likely to counter-argue, which is a little bit of what we saw going on this morning. So the result is that in some ways, these groups could construct their own realities. And this is a hypothesis, right? That their beliefs may come from the group itself. So the group acts as a filter that tells me what I should think about carnivores in this particular case. And so we went back to two data sets that we had, and we just attempted to test this hypothesis. So all the other stuff that I've shown you is published research. This is unpublished data from those same two data sets. So at first I went back to the most recent 2014 survey, and I just looked at residents of the Northern Rockies where wolves were reintroduced. So these are actually residents of the northern, what's called the Northern Rocky Mountain Distinct Population Segment. And what we found was we asked people to what extent they identified as an animal rights advocate, an environmentalist, a conservationist, a wildlife advocate, a hunter, a gun rights advocate, a farmer, rancher, or a property rights advocate. And what we found was that there was a significant relationship with many of these and their beliefs about the benefits associated with wolves, actually and the risks as well. I just didn't, for time, I'm not going to show you that slide, but it was very similar. And we said, okay, but what about those people that were in that issue public sample, the people that cared the most? What do you guys think happened when we apply the same model to the people that care the most? Do you think the relationships get weaker? Do they get stronger? Do they flip around? It's a rhetorical question. Okay. They get stronger. All the relationships jump way up. These people that really care, the more they identify as a member with one of these groups, the more strongly they are to hold this belief that wolves are beneficial. And the exact same is true about wolves being a high risk factor, meaning the groups help us construct our beliefs. And of course, there's one reality out there, right? We're entitled to our own views, but there's only one set of facts. There's only one reality. And this actually helps explain why these groups are perpetually in conflict with one another, okay? They're perpetually in conflict because they've constructed entirely different sets of beliefs, right? They view wolves and their impacts differently. Okay, I've just got a couple minutes, so I may skip a slide here. I want to show you one more kind of interesting effect of these. So we asked people to what extent they identify as a hunter. Okay, and this is one of the questions we actually use, it's been used for decades, about as a potential benefit. Wolves help keep deer and elk and moose populations in balance. And what you see is, as people identify as a hunter, they tend to disagree with that more frequently, okay? And then this is the one that really startled me, though. Does this identification actually affect behavior? So the extent to which the respondent identifies as a hunter, and then the percent that would indicate that they would shoot a wolf if they saw one. Okay? So first thing to point out is it never hits 50%. So hunters are, again, a very diverse group. I'll emphasize that. Mike said it. Most of them are not in this group, this very strongly group, and a very few of them are saying they would shoot a wolf if they saw one. But look at this giant effect of identifying very strongly as a hunter. Again, I'm not going to claim that this is the same in Germany. I don't want anyone to take away that message. What I want, if there's a message associated with this, it's that the interest groups that we identify with matter. They affect our judgments, they affect our actual behaviors, and they help perpetuate conflict. I have just a few seconds, I think. I'll show you one more slide. So what is the news media telling us? Well, over time, we tracked over a 10-year period what the news media is telling us, and the news media is saying more and more negative things in North America about wolves. And it's not just the news media, it's people that should know better. This is the director for the Utah Department of Natural Resources. In respect to our colleagues that speak German that don't speak English, it says, wolves are devastating the wildlife populations, and they're also devastating to the livestock population. The goal of our anti-grazing, anti-hunting friends, this is that rhetoric, interest group rhetoric, right? The goal of our anti-hunting, anti-grazing friends, if you can call them friends, is to end grazing and end hunting, and they have the perfect biological weapon, that biological weapon being the wolf. Okay? So this is somebody that should absolutely know better than to say something like that. All right, my time is up, so I will leave you with that. And thank you very much for your attention. I really, again, appreciate this opportunity.